Why did it take, until basically, the Trump administration under your, jurisdiction, and then later also under the Biden administration, for people involved in this persecution of Falun Gong practitioners to actually be sanctioned?
Well, the sanctions process is a long and because there are really legal consequences, you have to give people due process. You even have to give murderers due process.
But we're talking 20 years, right?
Well, a part of that, and again, this gets into another thing we've discussed, but part of that is the perception that human rights is somehow kind of the icing, and realpolitik is the cake, or trade is the cake, and human rights is the icing. When the reality is that we're dealing with human relationships across the board, whether they're trade relationships, economic, military, it's all about humans relating to humans. And so the idea that you could divorce human rights, we can set it aside for the time being while we deal with a pandemic or while we deal with trade, is ludicrous. Because if you know that the person on the other side of the table doesn't even consider you to be a human being, then how can you have a contract with them? You just can't. I mean, one of the most important human rights laws in this country was the Civil Rights Act of 1871 that said that African Americans had exactly the same contract rights as white people do. Because contract is private law, and only people who are equal can make enforceable contracts. Look at how the Chinese Communist Party dealt with the contract about Hong Kong. They didn't consider themselves to be making contracts with equals. They considered themselves to be making a contract with an invader. And so when the invader was gone, so was the contract.
Fascinating. Well, this is kind of obviously a foundational question, what you're discussing here right now. Because let's talk about the Olympics, right? There's a diplomatic boycott has been announced, and effectively here in the U.S. I think the UK is planning to follow suit. That's what it looks like anyway. Some other countries as well, possibly. At the same time, there's an Olympics happening as we speak. I've said this, sort of on record. I mean, to me, it feels worse than the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany, because we actually know what China is doing. One for sure. 3 genocides, and we're going to have an Olympic Games there. And even in Nazi Germany, we didn't even know exactly what the German Nazis' intentions were. What do you think about this?
Well, I think it's window dressing, to be honest with you. I think that you need to let young people get together and do their sports. I mean, that we do because we celebrate people, people's expertise. I mean, bow and arrow or hunting or tennis. I mean, all these things are wonderful. Skiing. I mean, it's amazing what people do. This is part of that human creative spirit. The mistake I think we've made over time is to allow governments to, quote, sponsor the Olympics. I mean, that's when they become a national spectacle, they become political and they're not sports anymore. And so, I've never been a fan of not letting the athletes participate. What I'm more concerned about is setting aside, we know what's going on in Xinjiang, for example. We know what's going on in Tibet. But we're going to import solar panels, made by slave labor in Xinjiang. That we got to put our money where our mouth is. And it's and I say that deliberately with the emphasis on money. Because again, if I learned anything in the State Department, it's follow the money. So the fact that you're not going to take a suite, in the hotel in Beijing is not the money we're talking about. The money we're talking about is the money that goes to big companies, you know, that extract the ore and the minerals and then process them using slave labor. That's the money we're talking about. And that's why you can raise questions about, and as Congress did in the infrastructure bill, was, well, give us a report on how much carbon are you burning to build a solar panel. You know, how much slave labor is there in that supply chain? I will guarantee you that's going to be completely downplayed, because that's where the money is.
And where the money is, that's where you're not allowed to look?
That's where you're not allowed, you're not supposed to look, because that then blows up the Green New Deal. Because the reality is, based on money, it's a Red New Deal, because China controls 95% of the solar panel market. You know, so all that money goes to China. You know, and American law currently forbids the importation of anything that's made with slave labor. Are we going to enforce that rule or not? If we're not going to enforce it, then don't tell me about diplomatic pressure on China. It's complete window dressing at that point.
Well, you're talking about something much broader here. I mean, there's so many of these financial connections. You know, how many Western companies were involved in developing the surveillance state in Xinjiang again, but and frankly throughout. And this has been something that's been in development for decades. I mean, there were U.S. companies involved in the development of this great firewall that keeps most Chinese outside of the global information architecture, right?
Well, but you're not supposed to notice that. I mean, you recall from a few years ago when they talked about blood diamonds. I mean, that was a catchy phrase. Well, what phrase do you use for solar panels? I mean, it's like at the
blood silicon.
It could be blood silicon. It could be, I don't know. I just don't know what you do. But the reality is that in this country we have accepted the proposition that products are not to be made in environments where you discriminate on the basis of race or sex or anything else, and we will hold those perpetrators accountable, either by money, by firing them, by doing whatever, right? Why can't we do that in the international sphere too? You can't set, in this country we haven't divided business and human rights. Why are we doing it with respect to China?
Well, why? You tell me.
Well, because there's too much money involved. There's a lot of corruption there. Look at LeBron James. I mean, he and I grew up in the same hometown. And he refuses to acknowledge, he's so focused on his basketball that he's not focusing on the human rights things that he says he's so concerned about. It's either money or it's I don't know.
So this makes me think of this broader question. Like, it's only really meaningful when it costs you something.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
It is, and it's also true that some of this stuff is so enormous that it's hard to get your head around what we're talking about. I mean, and that's why there's this narrative out there, that why is it, for example, that China has an exemption on its carbon emissions until 2050, 2060, so that the rest of the world can pollute China and then virtue signal that we're all putting solar panels on our roofs? What about the Tibetan Plateau? Has 5 major world rivers, and the downstream countries, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, I mean, they're all really worried the Chinese are going to shut off the water.
It's a lot of leverage.
That's a lot of leverage, and it's already starting. The next big commodity that people are going to fight over is water. We see in our own West, the fights over water. I mean, when you get into international space with armies, that's serious business we're talking about. So this idea that you can somehow separate, business and human rights, you just can't.
Well, and you raise this other question, you know, of this idea of kind of offshoring the things you don't want to be responsible for.
Oh yeah, I mean, we see that here in the United States. I mean, where does most of California's electric power come from? It's not generated in California. You know, that the pollution is done outside. And in China, I mean, the part of the reason why you can buy cheap stuff from China is that the cost of pollution is borne by the people of China. It's got the most polluted air, the most polluted water, you know, and what, we get to take advantage of that? You know, don't talk to me about human rights. You know, if you're talking about the right to a clean environment, then maybe I should have to pay more. That's implicitly one of the questions in the whole tariff question, is the Chinese have an advantage. You know, well, I mean, I saw an editorial in the New York Times, well, we all have to pay for it. Well, no paid, no gain. I mean, I should have to pay for it. If the choice is, you know, do I get a discount because a slave made the Christmas tree bulbs? That's a no-brainer. Most Americans would say, take it. You know, I'm not interested. You know, and the ones that are interested nonetheless don't talk to me about human rights then.
I think the cynical people, you know, kind of, I guess, doing these things say, well, the Americans say they want that, but they really don't, so we'll give them, you know, we'll keep that hidden from them.
Yeah, but that's transparency. I mean, do we, you know, it would be a lot better if we just said, we're going to impose an offsetting tariff for the environmental degradation you do. You know, if you want to compete, because our companies are not allowed to pollute. Their companies are. And so, in effect, aren't we accessories both before and after the fact of that crime? Of course we are. You know, but, you know, is it, those supply chains are really, I mean, everybody knows what a supply chain is now. You know, and what we need to do is be looking, just like you would say blood diamonds. Well, there's blood cobalt, there's blood silicon, you know, there's all that. And we need to be paid. People who are serious about human rights need to take those supply chains very seriously.
But you're saying human rights, to go back to your analogy, are the cake.
Yes, they're like the yeast in the bread, you know, or the baking, the flour. It's part. Humans, we consume that which other people make. So you know, even Marx said that capital is congealed labor. You know, so what I do, you know, when you do this interview, and then you edit it. It's my background and your expertise in editing, and together we produce a product. You know, that's human ingenuity. The same thing is true with a widget or a solar panel. It's not about panels, it's not about cobalt, it's about the people who make it. And we rely on each other. Do you really want to rely on somebody who's stealing somebody's liver? I mean, really. I mean, it's almost a stupid question to ask.
Yeah, well, it just, you know, it makes me think we're, you know, not in a very good state of human rights.
No, we're not. I mean, and that's the piece where I think we've forgotten the human part of human rights. We're very focused on the rights part. Speech, sex, right to free trial, all those really important things. But we value the right to free speech and the right to freedom of association because that's what people do. We can't communicate with one another. We know that a baby will die if it's abandoned. You know, so that human touch is really important because we're human. If we were some kind of a silicon Borg, then we might look at rights in a different way. But we are who we are, and that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was such an important development.
So this makes me think of I guess the theme that the UN has laid out for this year's Human Rights Day, which is Article 1 of the UDHR, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights equality. And you mentioned earlier that this idea that rights ultimately have to come from, I guess, something transcendent from God,
right.
As opposed to from, well, to me it's not clear actually in the UN Declaration where those rights actually come from.
Well, I mean, remember, any kind of a UN document is going to be a consensus document. So there are certain things you just don't say, because you're not going to get agreement. There were lots of disagreements going into the UDHR, and the fact that they actually got it through is a miracle all by itself. But the idea that we're born equal in dignity is like, well, where does that dignity come from? You don't have to be a believer to take the position that there's something special about human nature. That we're all equal in dignity. And the same thing is with rights. We're all equal in our dignity, and the rights that we have, basically are the ways in which we operationalize our dignity. So this question of equality, there's a big debate today about equality, but the way our Constitution deals with it is equality of protection. And that's what the UDHR says. It's equality of protection. Not some kind of an abstract notion of equalization.
Interesting. What do you make of, and I hear this all the time, what do you make of statements? We just spoke about this idea that the violations of human rights are frankly everywhere. They're here, they're in China, everywhere. You'll have someone like, for example, Ray Dalio on the record, being challenged. Look at all these violations in China, and his response, roughly speaking, is well, the U.S. has its own problems too. So let's not talk about that.
Well, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there, and when I say that, I mean that you want to talk about it here. Well, why can't we talk about it there? It's either we're going to talk about it or we're not going to talk about it. But you can't talk about it selectively. The reason people talk about it here is because we actually have a place we can go to complain about it. We can complain in the media, we can complain in the courts. I mean, the way the Constitution is framed, they divided up the authority, so we always have somebody to go complain to. That's what the right to petition for redress of grievances is. So the only time you don't complain is when you think it's not worth your time. And what he's implicitly conceding is, well, don't waste your breath. The Chinese aren't going to do anything. But he'll complain here because we have mechanisms here. And that's why this place is different than that place.
Fascinating. So you made some suggestions already about how to address China, and frankly, this would apply, I guess, to other countries
completely,
as well.
Yeah, not just China.
But so you've suggested, some sort of tariff, for example, on the pollution. That's an example. But in our current situation, there's these deep financial ties, of China into the whole international monetary system, and certainly the U.S. as a center of that. You're now in a situation where you can be a decision maker. You're not maybe faced with the bureaucracy that you were in the State Department. What is it that you do to try to somehow either hold China accountable or just simply create a better situation for the human rights of its people in the context of that being a value of this country?
The connection between business, and by business I'm speaking broadly now, from extraction, food production, and banking. So that's the whole gamut. That's really where the action is in human rights. Governments will react when businesses react. In Germany, Hitler couldn't have pulled off any of what he did without the private sector. The German bureaucracy didn't manufacture Zyklon B gas. That was done by I.G. Farben. So this question of, business and human rights, goes, when you look at who was held accountable, that's what the Nuremberg codes and trials were all about, holding everybody accountable who participated.
Right now, there's a lot of people not being held to account, and there's even questions about who would be doing the holding to account, right? And whether they have the, moral right to do that.
Well, as soon as you deny that we have the moral right to ask the questions, you've thrown human rights out the window. There was this sense after World War II that international organizations, these multinational organizations, would be the way to hold people accountable. Like every other human institution, however, they're subject to being corrupted. And that's what we see in many of them. I mean, when you look at the debate over the UN Human Rights Council, who are the members of the council? Iran, China. I mean, it's you think, is this some kind of a joke? Because then you get into these questions of moral equivalence and, well, you do it and we do it, and at the end it completely ignores the moral accountability that's at the heart of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the concern I have about companies, that are participating in the creation of the surveillance state. It's like they know exactly what that technology is going to be used for. And they're not averse to using it themselves. I mean, this was the creation of the Great Firewall of China. My problem is the Great Firewall of China beginning to envelop us.
Coming up on American Thought Leaders.
If you allow people to say, oh, declaring an emergency means that rights don't apply, then there's going to be lots of emergencies.
With the rise of big tech censorship and lockdowns of the unvaccinated, are the seeds of China's internet firewall and Orwellian social credit system now spreading to the West?
As soon as you can use pejoratives for people, whether you call it anti-vaxxer or anti-science or racist or whatever you want to call it, that's the road to tyranny.
In part 2 of my interview with Professor Robert Destro, we discuss the state of human rights in the United States and the rest of the Western world. Are there ever moral grounds for suspending human rights?
You have to stand up against tyranny, otherwise it will eat you alive.